Of all the legends of ancient Greece, the story of Troy and the great battle for the beautiful Helen has to be the most famous, known and loved the whole world over. This is a tale suspended somewhere between fact and fiction, though few of us would ever be prepared to let the truth get in the way of this truly romantic, heroic story. We're talking epic here, so be prepared for an amazing journey of discovery to a long-lost land, if it ever really existed at all, where the search for Troy will inevitably lead us. Follow in the footsteps of the mighty heroes, Achilles, Hector, Paris, Menelaus, and Agamemnon, and you'll find yourself in very good company. Great leaders and travellers have since sought inspiration upon the plain of Troy, ranging from Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, right through to the infamous romantic poet Lord Byron. Many have harboured ambitious schemes to rebuild Troy and restore it to its former glory, but as yet, none have succeeded. If you want to visit Troy today, destination will be the Aegean region of Turkey, but don't expect to see an architectural wonder of the world. The site is now known as Hisarlik, which translates from Turkish as the Castle Kingdom, but there's little to see beyond more than a century's worth of archaeological excavations. However, just to stand on the hallowed ground of Troy, said to be soaked in the blood of heroes and inhabited by their ghosts, is an inspirational experience, but you'll need to give free rein to your imagination. And to do that, we need to step right back in time to piece together the fascinating historical conundrum that is Troy. There's evidence in the ancient history books of a war between the Greeks and the Trojans in 1250 BC. To set this in context, it was a time when the Phoenicians were exploring the oceans and opening up trade routes worldwide. Biblically speaking, Moses had just parted the Red Sea and let the Israelites out of Egypt, escaping from slavery under Ramesses II. Centuries behind the Egyptians, the people of ancient Britain had just about progressed from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age, but we are nevertheless talking a very long time ago, and little of our modern-day perception of Troy originated from the actual historical records. In fact, we have one of the world's greatest ever storytellers to thank for the legend of Troy. Little is known about the life of the poet Homer, but his name is familiar in every country of the world, and his epic works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, tell the tale of the fall of Troy and the victorious army's journey home to Greece, respectively. Homer lived in the 8th century BC and is generally thought to have been blind. However, although this might prove something of a setback for later writers, because the written word didn't feature in Homer's work in any way, shape or form, blindness was no handicap. It might actually have helped him create the images of the lovely Helen and the mighty Achilles more vividly, because his renditions of the story have certainly stood the test of time. Homer was what's known as a bard, basically an entertainer who recited his poems to audiences from far and wide. The legend of Troy would have been part of the culture of the people of Homer's time, and their familiarity with the subject matter would have allowed him plenty of artistic license as a performer. Today, we only know Homer's works as written texts, but for which later scholars are responsible. So who can say how accurate a representation of what Homer actually performed they might be? Nevertheless, it's from this great oral tradition of legend and storytelling that our search for Troy must begin. There was a time, and not so very long ago, when studying the classics was accepted as an essential part of any academic education. But gradually, with advances in medicine, science and technology, the classics have lost many students to subjects with more practical applications. Consequently, before going any further on this quest, we'll embark on a very brief tour of Homer's storytelling tradition and take a look at the origins of the main protagonists in this classic Greek drama. If you travel through Greece and Turkey today, you'll find plenty of examples of temples and monuments to the ancient Greek gods, some undoubtedly much better known than others. The most familiar of all has to be Zeus, the king of the gods, who lived on Mount Olympus with his fellow immortals. The roles played by the various gods offered mere mortals an explanation of how the natural world worked, and by worshipping the appropriate gods for their needs, their lot in life could be improved. Zeus was married to Hera, but he definitely wasn't ideal husband material, having numerous affairs with mortal women. It didn't help that they were also brother and sister, but that's just the stuff of gods. Hera was constantly dashing off to punish her husband's lovers, and, not surprisingly, one of their daughters, Eris, was the vengeful goddess of spite. But more of this dysfunctional family a little later. Aphrodite was the goddess of love. Apollo, god of the sun. Dionysus, god of wine. Demeter, goddess of the earth. Athene, goddess of wisdom and war. Pan, god of nature. Pluto, king of the underworld. Poseidon, god of the sea. And Uranus, god of the sky. And these are just a few examples of the most influential gods. As well as the immortals, there were also monsters and heroes. Hercules, son of Zeus and a mortal woman, was the most popular of the Greek heroes, who was driven to 12 labours by the jealous Hera. When he succeeded, he became immortal, but the great Achilles was not so fortunate. Son of the mortal Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, Achilles' mother was determined to make him immortal. One version of the story is that she held him as a baby by the heel and dipped him in the sacred river Styx. Achilles, as a result, could never be harmed except for one weak spot on the back of his heel, where to this day the tendon is still known as the Achilles. Not wanting to give too much away at this stage, we'll leave the story of Achilles for the time being, but it's definitely a name to remember. At the mention of Troy, the two images that most immediately spring to mind are the beautiful Helen and the infamous wooden horse. And as it's with Helen that the story of the Trojan War begins, it's a very good place to start the proceedings. Who was Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships? Well, she in fact started out as Helen of Sparta, flesh and blood, but conceived in very unusual circumstances. Her mother was Leda, Queen of Sparta, a powerful state in southern Greece, a mortal who'd attracted the attention of Zeus, king of the gods. If you look at a map of Greece, you'll certainly be able to spot the ancient city of Sparti, but that's about as close to reality as this story is going to get. Zeus was rather partial to taking on various forms and ravishing mortal women, and that's how Helen was conceived. Zeus arrived to have his wicked way with Leda in the form of a swan, and the story of Leda and the swan has inspired countless artists and poets throughout the ages. Leda is impregnated by Zeus, and later that day she lies with her husband Tyndareus, who also impregnates her. Curiouser and curiouser, Leda then produces 2 eggs. Out of one egg hatches the offspring of Zeus, the immortal Helen, and her brother Pollux. Out of the other egg hatches the mortal offspring of Tyndareus, his daughter Clytemnestra, and his son Castor. In classical mythology, the boy twins Castor and Pollux were incredibly close, and when Castor died, Pollux spent 6 months of every year in the underworld with his brother, and the remainder of his time on Mount Olympus with the rest of the gods. Helen grew to be the most beautiful woman in Greece, and from all over the land suitors flocked to seek her hand in marriage. Tyndareus, as her official father, chose the powerful, wealthy Menelaos, but he was far from handsome and considerably older than Helen. It was also a dynastic match, as Helen's sister, Clytemnestra, was married to the brother of Menelaos, the even more powerful Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most important of the Greek kingdoms. While all this was going on in Greece, back at Troy, the king, Priam, had been busy restoring the city after an earlier attack. With 50 sons and 12 daughters, the king of Troy had quite a dynasty of his own, and with his beloved eldest son Hector and second son Paris, his lineage seemed assured. We know from Homer's Iliad that Troy was well-walled, very windy, and that the people of Troy were renowned as horse tamers, and the prospect of war with Greece was not an immediate issue. But destiny was truly in the lap of the gods, and with mischief afoot, trouble was definitely on the horizon. Of all the immortals to antagonise, Eris, goddess of spite, was troublesome indeed. When she didn't receive an invitation to the wedding of the sea goddess Thetis and mortal Peleus, future parents of Achilles, Eris turned up anyway with a golden apple to be awarded to the fairest goddess of them all. This certainly caused quite a stir, as Hera, wife of Zeus, Aphrodite, goddess of love, and Athene, goddess of wisdom, all started to argue about which of them was the fairest goddess. Naturally, when things started to get out of hand, they turned to Zeus as king of the gods to settle the dispute. Being married to the jealous Hera, Zeus was in a very awkward position, so he delegated the final judgment to none other than Paris, son of King Priam of Troy. Paris was young and very handsome, and the 3 powerful goddesses all attempted to influence him. Hera offered power, lands and riches. Athene offered victory in war and wisdom above all men. But Aphrodite's offer was just too tempting. She told Paris that in return for the prize of the golden apple, she could promise him Helen, now acknowledged as the most beautiful woman in the world, as his wife. It was some years before Aphrodite's promise was fulfilled, and when Paris went to Sparta as the guest of Menelaus, he finally met the beautiful but very much spoken for Helen. As all men before him, Paris fell immediately in love with her, and thanks to a charm placed upon Helen by Aphrodite, she also fell in love with him. Now, as Menelaus had no idea of how the gods had plotted against him, when his grandfather died on the island of Crete, he set off for the funeral, leaving Paris to entertain his lovely young wife. Paris, as any self-respecting royal prince, had his own ship, and as soon as Menelaus was safely out of the way, the star-crossed lovers fled Sparta, embarking on their fateful course to Troy. For the people of Troy, the danger Helen posed was obvious, and even old King Priam was apprehensive at his son bringing home such a prize. However, the moment he set eyes upon Helen, as undoubtedly you will by now have been able to predict, he was completely won over by her beauty, as were the rest of the Trojans. Priam vowed to protect Helen for as long as she wanted to stay in Troy. When Paris and Helen married, national pride overflowed, because the most beautiful woman in the world was no longer Helen of Sparta, she was from that day forward Helen of Troy. It didn't take long for news of the couple's elopement to reach Menelaus, who made a swift return to Greece to raise an army to bring Helen back. Agamemnon, his all-powerful brother, took Helen's departure as a personal family insult and backed the preparations for war, calling upon all of his fellow kings of Greece to rally against Troy. And so the storm clouds of war gathered, and the great Greek heroes, Odysseus, Achilles, and Ajax, joined with the mighty armies of Menelaus and Agamemnon to set sail in the famous 1,000 ships for Troy. Legend has it that the conflict lasted for 10 years, and it's after this passage of time that Homer's Iliad actually takes up the story. When the Greek armies finally grouped together for the main assault on Troy, the elements were definitely set against them. With no wind to fill the sails and famine in the district, all looked very bleak. A prophet was called in and announced that Agamemnon had offended Artemis, the goddess of the moon, and that was the cause of the trouble. To make amends, Agamemnon would have to sacrifice his most beautiful daughter, Iphigenia, to appease the vengeful goddess. The deed was done. The wind changed, and the Greek fleet was on its way. But years later, Agamemnon would pay the highest price for sacrificing Iphigenia. And now Homer's Iliad and the story of the Trojan War begins in earnest. Achilles emerges as the great Greek hero of the conflict, distinguishing himself in battle, taking some 23 towns in Trojan territory. As a war prize, he took the slave girl Briseis, but this was to be the cause of conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. The oracle of Apollo forced Agamemnon to give up his own war prize, the woman called Chrysis, and some crisis this certainly caused. Agamemnon, having lost out, demanded Achilles give him Briseis as compensation, much to the displeasure of Achilles. An almighty row ensued, leading to the less senior Achilles, who had already proved himself to be the bravest and most successful of the Greeks, refusing to fight anymore. No amount of inducement would change Achilles' mind, and the war went very badly for the Greeks. Eventually, his only concession was to allow his best friend, Patroclus, to fight in his place, wearing Achilles' armour. It's worth pointing out here that when you're talking about friends, most notably of the male variety in relation to ancient Greece, it's a very sacred bond that you're dealing with. If Achilles was top dog for the Greeks, then his counterpart in the Trojan army was Hector, the beloved firstborn son of old Priam. Hardly surprising, in the heat of the battle, Hector spotted the distinctive suit of armour belonging to Achilles, and naturally assumed that his opposite number was to be found within. Hector slayed his adversary, but when he stripped the dead Greek of his armour, he soon realised it was Patroclus he'd killed, and not Achilles at all. Achilles was overwhelmed with grief at the loss of his friend, and his anger erupted on an epic scale. His mother, Thetis, the sea goddess, implored Hephaestus, the god of craftsmen, to make a magnificent new suit of armour for Achilles. Decked out in his new finery, Achilles was hell-bent on revenge, searched out Hector and killed him. But honour had not yet been satisfied, and with manic delight, Achilles cruelly hitched up the body of Hector to his chariot and dragged it by the ankles around the walls of Troy. It was callous behaviour indeed, even by ancient standards, and Achilles continued hauling Hector around for 12 days, only ceasing when the gods intervened. Zeus sent King Priam, undetected, to Achilles' tent under the cover of darkness, where the old man begged for his son's desecrated body. Achilles relented, and Hector was finally given a decent burial. Although Greek heroes were higher placed than mere mortals, part of their appeal was often their more human failings, and Achilles certainly fitted into this category. His exploits are some of the most popular in Greek legend, and his meeting with Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, is no exception. The Amazons were a tribe of warrior women who were reputed to cut off their right breasts to make it easier to use their bows and arrows, and on this occasion they'd come to the aid of the Trojan army. When the fierce queen came face to face and weapon to weapon with Achilles, their eyes met at the very moment that Achilles struck the fatal blow, and when all was lost, they fell in love at the exact moment when the Amazon woman died. Despite his great victories, Achilles had been destined to die in the struggle for Troy, and the prophecy was fulfilled when an arrow shot from the bow of Paris struck Achilles in the heel. His remains were treated far more kindly than Hector's, and his ashes were consigned to a tomb overlooking the waters of the Hellespont. This weakened the position of the Greeks dramatically, and with so many heroes dead upon the Trojan plain, they knew they'd have to change their strategy. Paris had been killed, but still the people of Troy refused to give up Helen, and the war continued. Earlier on, we heard that the people of Troy were famous for their abilities with horses, so what better way could there be to get into the enemy's stronghold than with the gift of the famous wooden horse? There's a well-known saying, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," and it would have been very good advice for the Trojans to take. Before sailing away, as if in retreat, the Greeks built a huge hollow wooden horse in which they concealed the elite fighting forces of their army. A rumour was instigated that the horse, placed at the gates of Troy, was an offering to the goddess Athene, and if it was taken inside the city, then Troy could never be lost. It was a strategy that worked. The Trojans, busy celebrating what they perceived as victory over the departed Greeks, dragged it through the gates, and when night fell, the Greek fighters emerged from the horse to start the attack from within. They were quickly reinforced by the rest of the Greek army, who, in the darkness, had sailed back into position. Troy suffered total destruction and was burnt to the ground. All the men and boys of the city were massacred, and the women and children taken back to Greece as slaves. Priam and all his descendants were brutally murdered, and this particular glorious era of Troy came to a tragic end, all for the possession of a beautiful face. Helen herself survived the furor, and even married again after the death of Paris. But needless to say, once Menelaus arrived on the scene, the new husband didn't last very long. In fact, Menelaus had intended to kill Helen as soon as he caught up with her, but when faced with her radiant beauty, yes, you've guessed it, he fell under her spell and took her back as his queen. There are those who found it impossible to believe that Achilles, the great hero of Troy, failed to have a romantic connection with Helen, and some tales will tell of them actually being married in the underworld when they eventually died. It's an interesting concept. Helen was, after all, the daughter of Zeus, and as such, immortal. But with the whole story of Troy being such a litany of legend and mythology, it's not worth getting pedantic over technicalities. This is where Homer's Iliad draws to its lengthy conclusion, but the Odyssey carries on with the adventures of Odysseus and Agamemnon as they travelled back to Greece. Some travellers took as long as 10 years to find their way home, having great adventures along the way, but in Agamemnon's case, tragedy awaited him in the form of his wronged wife, Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra, hatched out of the other egg, remember, sister of Helen, was a vengeful mother, driven mad by the loss of her beloved daughter, Iphigenia, at the hands of her father, Agamemnon. After 10 years ruling Mycenae in her husband's absence, Clytemnestra welcomed him back as a conquering hero, only to brutally murder him at the first opportunity. The cycle of tragedy was only completed when Orestes and Electra, son and daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, murdered their mother. Should you ever find yourself in possession of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the first thing that will strike you is the extensive length of these volumes of epic verse. The rendition of the story of Troy, just presented for the purposes of this programme, has been literally cut down to the barest essentials. To do justice to this incredible story that's provided so much inspiration for the arts, ranging from poetry and painting to opera and modern drama, we need to dig a great deal deeper. The dictionary definition of archaeology is the study of man's past by scientific analysis of the material remains of his cultures. And if we're talking about digging, quite literally, in our search for Troy, then archaeology is without doubt the key to understanding. Heinrich Schliemann's name is synonymous with the archaeological study of Troy, and he's been responsible to a major extent for our modern-day perception of the great Trojan story. Born in January 1822, Schliemann was truly a man of his time, making the most of every new opportunity this great age of discovery afforded him. A native of Mecklenburg, Germany, Schliemann, the son of a clergyman, was at best an incurable romantic, and at worst, a charlatan, who even described himself in less than complimentary terms. However, he was evidently of the belief that the means justified the end when he confessed to being a braggart and a bluffer, while proudly noting that this had yielded him countless advantages. Our 21st century image of an archaeologist would suggest a dedicated scholar, well taught in a fine seat of learning, but for Schliemann it was the University of Life that had provided his education. As a businessman in St. Petersburg, he achieved financial success, but his dealings often bordered on the unscrupulous. Schliemann cornered the market for gunpowder ingredients during the Crimean War, and when he turned his attention to America, Californian gold rush prospectors provided him with the means to exploit the gold market. True to form, Schliemann didn't miss the opportunity to make a fast buck when the Civil War tore the United States apart, claiming that he'd made his money trading in cotton. But wherever his money came from, by the late 1850s, Schliemann was a wealthy man, but he'd already started to turn away from commerce in search of a more intellectual way to spend his time. At first, he hoped to follow a scientific path. It was, after all, an era of great discovery and advancement, with chemists, physicists, engineers, astronomers and doctors all making revered names for themselves as 19th century celebrities. But this was definitely too much like hard work, and Schliemann became quickly discouraged. Now, if we believe Schliemann's autobiography, he had been fascinated with the idea of finding and excavating Troy since he was a small boy. At the age of 8, he claims that his father gave him a Christmas present of Gera's Universal History. When the precocious youngster read about Troy, he explained the following to Schliemann Sr. "Father, if such walls once existed, they cannot have been completely destroyed. Vast ruins of them must still remain hidden away between the dust of ages." You could certainly be forgiven for being more than a tad sceptical about the little smarty pants, because it's been suggested that the first the father knew of this nostalgic tale was when he read about it in his son's book, Ilios, which was published in 1880. Yet whatever the difficulties concerning Schliemann's biographical details, we do know that, like many devotees of Homer's Iliad, he did travel to Greece and Turkey in 1868 to see the landscape of his very active imagination. A chance meeting with Frank Calvert, an Englishman who'd lived all of his life on the Troad, turned Schliemann's attention away from science towards the relatively new discipline of archaeology. Frank Calvert was so convinced that the mound at Hisarlik, the only vantage point for miles around on the Trojan plain, was the site of Homer's Troy. He bought the northern part of the hill so that he could begin excavating. Unfortunately for Calvert, Schliemann would later take all the credit for discovering Hisarlik as the location for ancient Troy, based upon Calvert's lifetime's worth of deductions. It's interesting at this point to look a little more closely at archaeology and why it became so popular at this point in history, bringing the story of Troy and the ancient Greeks to life, particularly for the well-to-do, educated gentlemen of the 19th century. From the mid-1700s onwards, every young English gentleman of good family was expected to undertake a journey, perhaps lasting up to as long as 2 years, around Europe. Usually accompanied by a tutor, the young gentleman would be exposed to the cultural delights of France, Germany and Italy with its magnificent Roman remains. Collecting works of art became a significant occupation, and it wasn't long before the results of this journey of discovery started to appear across every aspect of fashionable life. By the early 19th century, the Grand Tour, as it became known, had expanded to also explore the Ottoman Empire, which included such destinations as Greece and Turkey, and young American gentlemen also began to take the tour to finish their educations. Travel was a new and wonderful pastime that anyone who considered themselves to be anyone aspired to. The major area of influence was architecture, and young men in possession of houses and land returned home inspired by the Acropolis and the Parthenon. New buildings sprang up in neoclassical style, while old crumbling ancestral piles were renovated with Greek columns and Doric arches and garden follies, complete with statues of the ancient Greek gods, were the very height of fashion and good taste. If you travel to the beautiful British city of Bath, you can see many examples of neoclassical architecture that have certainly weathered better than the ancient ruins of Troy. Bath, as a spa, boasting natural springs of health-giving mineral water, was very popular with the fashion-conscious of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it rapidly expanded from a sleepy rural market town to an elegant watering hole for the rich and famous. As a by-the-by, the reason the waters were so beneficial to health was purely down to their laxative qualities, because the wealthy Georgians who frequented Bath were definitely prone to overeating. Ironically, even today, you get the feeling that Achilles, Paris, and even the lovely Helen would be perfectly at home amongst the splendid columns and sweeping arches of Bath's distinctive architectural landscape. And if they'd been overdoing the ambrosia consumption, the favoured food of the gods, then they could still take a glass of bath water from the pump rooms to aid the digestion. There are other fine examples of city developments from this period of history, and the area known as the New Town in Scotland's capital, Edinburgh, is certainly equal to Bath in its beauty and elegance. With crescents and squares just a few minutes' walk from the hustle and bustle of the hectic shopping centre, you can be transported back in time for a real Georgian neoclassical treat. However, for anyone who's an interest in Grecian-inspired architecture, you couldn't leave Edinburgh without exploring the treasures of Calton Hill. Here you'll find a replica of the Parthenon in Athens, which comes as quite a surprise on this windy Scottish hillside. Sadly, this Parthenon was never completed, as the money ran out before the project was finished. But the people of Edinburgh are equally as fond of their Parthenon as the good Greeks of Athens are of theirs. Undoubtedly, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. But sadly, for the great ancient cities of Greece and Turkey, the majority of the awe-inspired tourists were not simply content with recreating what they'd seen on their travels when they got home. The new pastime of archaeology was literally unearthing all manner of treasures, and what could be more natural than taking home what you dug up? There was little understanding of the culture that was being robbed, and a newly growing trend for museums proved very popular. This is the British Museum in London, and you can see precisely where the inspiration for this classical Greek portico came from. It's actually the oldest museum in the world, built in 1753. And its many rooms are packed with treasures brought back by 18th and 19th century travellers and explorers. The British aristocracy certainly benefited from their early souvenir collecting, and here in the British Museum, to this very day, you'll find a highly controversial exhibit. When Lord Elgin visited the Parthenon, majestically shadowing the city of Athens, he was evidently very taken with the stunning marble frieze that decorated an interior wall. Between 1801 and 1803, he acquired extensive sections of this Grecian treasure and transported it back to England, where in 1816 he sold his memento of his time in Greece to the British Museum for a staggering £35,000. In our more enlightened times today, the Greek government takes a very dim view of this, albeit historic, piracy, and has demanded the return of the so-called Elgin marbles to their proper place. In their defence, the British Museum claimed to have taken the greatest care of the marbles, preserving them in a way that would not have been possible in the Parthenon. However, this is a debate that's unlikely to be resolved in the near future, and who can say whether these controversial marbles will ever find their way home. This does add an extra perspective to Schliemann's archaeological explorations at Troy. £35,000 was an awful lot of money in 1816. Just 50 years earlier, King George III had bought Buckingham Palace for £28,000. Not to mention the celebrity the whole incident had created for Lord Elgin. His name is still attached to the marbles to this day, for no other reason than his plunder of the Parthenon. Schliemann undoubtedly wanted to make his name as a serious scholar, but if fame and fortune came his way as an added bonus, he wasn't going to object, and the archaeological excavation of Troy presented him with the perfect opportunity to realise his dreams. Even as early as the mid-1860s, the Turkish government was very wary about travellers from far and wide digging up their not insignificant treasure trove. By the time Schliemann arrived on the scene, archaeological explorations on the Trojan plain were already being regulated. To get his permit, Schliemann agreed to share his finds with the authorities, half the artefacts going to the newly established Turkish National Museum, pay for all the costs involved, and, most importantly, restore the site to the state in which he'd found it, with no damage done to any of the uncovered structures. The only condition that Schliemann honoured was to pay for his own workings, much to the horror and dismay of the Turkish authorities, but this is without doubt as complex a story as that of ancient Troy itself, as you're about to discover. To bring this scenario into a modern context, imagine a sudden, totally unexpected archaeological find. Would a complete novice be allowed free rein to dig up the site? The answer is, of course not, but that is precisely what happened when Schliemann was let loose on the site at Hisarlik. When Schliemann started digging, he was, to say the very least, confused by what he found. Instead of working with small manageable excavations, as advised by local expert Frank Calvert, Schliemann dug vast trenches, removing ton upon ton of valuable rubble, demolishing history in his overexcited wake. It won't come as any great surprise that Calvert refused to allow Schliemann to dig on his side of the mound. And when Calvert spotted a flaw in Schliemann's interpretations, the German did not take kindly to criticism, denouncing the more experienced archaeologist as a liar. Now, although you wouldn't describe this as a new Trojan War exactly, there was no dragging of anyone by the ankles around the excavated walls of Troy in the style of Achilles and Hector. The battle lines were most definitely being drawn. Then, within just a matter of weeks of the altercation with Calvert, Schliemann had the luckiest break of his life. On the 31st of May 1873, according to Schliemann's diary entry, he discovered a vast hoard of treasure concealed in a copper cauldron. The find is still to this day referred to as the Treasure of Priam, and for Schliemann it was justification that he had indeed found Homer's Troy and the palace of old King Priam. Amongst the gold and silver cups, thousands of gold rings, bracelets, earrings and copper lance heads were two splendid headdresses. The most striking of these two items was this beautiful diadem made up of over 16,000 tiny pieces of gold threaded onto gold wire. Dubbed the Jewels of Helen, the headdress was photographed being worn by Schliemann's wife Sophie, and it caused a sensation when it was first released. But controversy surrounded the find. Firstly, Schliemann exaggerated the story, saying that he could not have removed the treasures without the help of his dear wife, who stood next to him as he worked, wrapping the treasures in her shawl. This was total fabrication, because Sophie Schliemann was in Athens at the time. Also, doubt has been cast over this treasure all being unearthed at the same time. Some suspect that Schliemann had been collecting the items over a period of time, keeping the information to himself so that he could smuggle the treasure out of Turkey unchallenged. An American team of archaeologists who re-excavated the exact area in the 1930s found an abundance of scattered gold, which would certainly add credence to this story. However, the most significant point is the fact that Schliemann's diary entry for discovering Priam's treasure on the 31st of May 1873 was not actually written up until he and the treasure had safely reached Athens on the 17th of June. The Turkish authorities were furious and hot on Schliemann's trail, but the man himself was jubilant because he was at last taken seriously as an archaeologist. With advances in modern technology, the question marks hanging over Priam's treasure could easily be resolved with access to the Jewels of Helen and the other pieces, but sadly, this isn't possible. At the end of World War II, the treasures disappeared from Berlin, only re-emerging at the Pushkin Museum in Russia in 1996. But authentication has proved controversial, and the legend of the Jewels of Helen is set to continue for many years to come. There are always if-onlys and missed opportunities with a story like this, but the British Museum must to this day regret their failure to grant Frank Calvert's request in 1863 for £100 to begin excavations at Hisarlik. It's very possible the treasure of Priam and the Jewels of Helen would be safely on display in London if they'd done so, and undoubtedly the story of the archaeological discovery of Troy would have gone down very differently in the history books. It's very easy, more than a century after Schliemann's finds at Troy, to judge the man's faults by our modern-day standards. But this would overlook the true essence of what made up his character and do him an injustice. Schliemann was highly motivated by romanticism, passion, and a genuine fascination with the epic works of Homer. It cost him considerable personal sums of money to make his discoveries, and life on the Trojan plain was far from comfortable. Homer was certainly accurate when he described Troy as very windy, and with malaria, insects and constitutional issues to contend with, Schliemann and his wife often suffered ill health. Schliemann constantly battled with constipation, which was definitely unpleasant on an archaeological dig, but his remedy of a bottle of best English stout every day would certainly have lifted his spirits. This was not the end of Schliemann's association with Troy, and on a visit to Mycenae in Greece in 1868, he'd been convinced that the Victorian Greek heroes of Troy lay buried in tombs there. Archaeology scholars dismissed his theories as preposterous when he insisted that the tomb of Agamemnon lay inside the famous Lion Gate, but it would take Schliemann years to prove his point. In September 1876, Schliemann returned to Mycenae and the Lion Gate, armed with a permit from the Greek authorities, no doubt boosted by his success at Hisarlik. With the courage of his convictions, fortune once again smiled on Schliemann as he hit the jackpot. There were 5 grave shafts just inside the confines of the Lion Gate, and the bodies contained within were covered in gold and surrounded by treasure. This had to be a royal tomb, and Schliemann was convinced that he'd gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. My firm faith in the traditions made me undertake my late excavations in the Acropolis of Mycenae, and led to the discovery of the 5 tombs with their immense treasures. I have not the slightest objection to admitting that the tradition which assigns the tombs to Agamemnon and his companions may be perfectly correct. It was another archaeological sensation. The newspapers all around the world were full of Schliemann's find. Heralded as a genius, the man himself lectured all over Europe and was accepted amongst the highest echelons of society, and the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, a lifelong devotee of the classics, wrote the preface for Schliemann's book, Mycenae. This was a great find for Schliemann, despite the fact that even at the time of the discovery, there were rumours flying that he'd given history a helping hand, fabricating some of the treasures he'd uncovered. In retrospect, we now of course know from more accurate dating techniques that the tombs, the treasures, and even the golden death mask of Agamemnon are from a much earlier period, and couldn't possibly be connected with Homer's heroes. But every piece of evidence suggests that in this case at least, Schliemann truly believed his own claims on this occasion. In truth, we have as much chance of proving the authenticity of Schliemann's methods as we do of proving that Achilles, Hector, Helen and Agamemnon were real people caught up in the legendary Trojan War. However, what we can be certain of is the fact that Heinrich Schliemann paved the way for the archaeologists who would have the knowledge to really uncover the secrets of Troy to follow in his footsteps. Wilhelm Dorpfeld, Arthur Evans and Carl Blegen were all equally as romantic and visionary as Schliemann had been, but with greater academic skills were better able to piece together the puzzle. Yet even in the 21st century, many of the strands that go to make up the amazing conundrum that is Troy are still missing, and that's an intrinsic part of this story's enduring charm. In a world where there's little left to discover, short of travelling all the way to Mars, you can still journey to the plain of Troy and come up with your own theories. Okay, so you can't start digging up great trenches like Schliemann did. The Turkish authorities took a very dim view of what he got up to, and any archaeological investigations today are very carefully regulated. But you can stand where Achilles and Hector fought to the death and make up your own mind. Because this story is a cacophony of fact, fiction, myth and legend, even the most eminent expert on the subject couldn't prove beyond question what happened at Troy, or even if the Trojan War complete with the lovely Helen and wooden horse was ever actually fought. So the world's your oyster. let the imagination run as free as Homer's, as we enjoy a modern-day whistle-stop tour of some of the best-loved locations associated with Troy, and take a closer look at the surprising number of heroes to have passed this way in search of inspiration. When it comes to the stuff of legend, there are few to compete with the mighty Achilles and Hector, but Alexander the Great is certainly high up on the roll of honour. It's claimed that Alexander carried a copy of Homer's Iliad with him on all his journeys, sleeping with the epic lines under his pillow. And when you find out a little more about him, it's easy to see the connection. Alexander became king of Macedonia, a great military power in northeastern Greece, at the age of 21. The young monarch considered himself to be a descendant of Achilles on his mother's side and Hercules on his father's, and he definitely was prone to godlike delusions of grandeur on this score, most notably when it came to throwing a good despotic tantrum. Despite Alexander's youth, he was a man in a hurry, and he quickly established himself as the leader of all Greece before turning his attention east towards what was then Asia Minor, but known today as Turkey. After crossing the Hellespont at Gallipoli, a literal gateway between Europe and Asia, his first port of call was Troy, following in the ancestral footsteps of Achilles. Alexander was, even at this early stage in his illustrious career, very superstitious, and his behaviour was positively ritualistic. After a naked charge around the tomb of Achilles, he made his way to the small, walled town that was all that remained of Troy. In the temple of the goddess Athena, he was shown the weapons said to have belonged to Achilles, including his shield. Alexander took the shield of Achilles, replaced it with his own, and from that day forward he was never again parted with it until he died. It was a long and often bloody campaign, covering more than 5,000 miles in distance, and the shield of Achilles saved Alexander's life on more than one occasion. However, despite seeking the blessings of the ancient city of Troy, Alexander was not destined to live long and die peacefully in his bed. If history is to be believed, at the age of 32, Alexander caught a fever and died. But to say that the cause of death was suspicious would indeed be an understatement. But that, as they say, is quite another story. And from the modern-day visitor's point of view, the fact that Alexander never returned to Troy to fulfill his promise to restore the site of his ancestors' great victory to its former glory is perhaps a little disappointing. But Alexander the Great wasn't the only man to dream of rebuilding Troy. The Emperor Constantine seriously considered the location for his great city. Unfortunately, by this time the bay had silted up, and Troy could no longer be a harbour. So Constantine founded Constantinople further north, where the magnificent metropolis of Istanbul stands to this day. Julius Caesar, the mighty Roman conqueror, also passed this way, paying homage to his antecedents. Rome was quite often referred to as the New Troy, because it was said to have been founded by Aeneas, a Trojan who'd fled westwards after the war was lost. If you look at his Salic and feel it's a bit of a letdown, you're in very good company, because Julius Caesar commented that even the ruins had been destroyed, and that was in 48 BC. So don't feel you're a Philistine if you can't quite appreciate the dramatic history of the place at first glance. Not everybody who was inspired by Troy as the centuries came and went had the opportunity to walk upon the Trojan plain. For many people of the world, the long succession of English kings and queens can be somewhat tedious, and few will have heard of King Alfred the Great, who ruled before the first millennium. Generations of English schoolchildren, however, managed to remember this particular monarch, as popular legend had it that King Alfred burnt the cakes. Whilst in hiding as a youth, he allegedly was given the task of minding the oven, which he failed miserably. Whether there's any truth in this is difficult to say, and when you find out a little more about Alfred and his constant battles with marauding Vikings, you can't help feeling that he had rather more on his mind than a batch of baking. However, despite being born well and truly in the Dark Ages, Alfred was an educated man who'd twice travelled to Rome to visit the Pope. He was well read, and evidently had come into contact with Homer's epic verse, because Alfred was a devotee of Troy. The ancient tradition of storytelling around communal fires would have been the most popular form of entertainment for Alfred's armies, and it's very probable that he inspired his troops with tales of Paris and Achilles and the heroic battles on the plain of Troy. No doubt Homer would have been delighted that his storytelling tradition had been reinstated so many miles and centuries distant from the lands of ancient Greece. What's more, Alfred the Great wasn't the only English monarch to appreciate the splendour of Troy. Elizabeth I was said to actually be a descendant of old King Priam, and as one of the few truly powerful women in history, it was natural that people linked her to the dynastic tale of Troy that was becoming increasingly popular in the 16th century. Although the fiery red-headed queen might have enjoyed being compared to the beautiful Helen, Elizabeth I was actually painted in The Judgment of Paris, receiving the golden apple of Eris in preference to Hera, Athene and Aphrodite. It was evidently a wise court painter who flattered his monarch in such style, rewriting the great legends to please a queen. The Elizabethan era was a time of storytelling, with the likes of the world's greatest dramatist, William Shakespeare, entertaining the masses with legends of the past. Such mighty historical figures as Julius Caesar received the Shakespeare treatment, and Homer's tales provided much of the inspiration for his play Troilus and Cressida. Today, if you come across an old copy of either Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, look carefully at the frontispiece, and you'll see it's been translated by a fellow called Alexander Pope, one of the greatest English poets in the epic tradition. Following on from where Shakespeare left off a century later, Pope translated Homer's legendary tales for all to enjoy. This can only be described as a true labour of love, taking some 5 years to complete all of the volumes, but none of the power and the passion of the story had been lost in the sands of time. It was a huge success, making Pope the first author in his nation's history to live entirely on the proceeds of his writing. More importantly, Alexander Pope made Troy the province of the great poets that were yet to come, and although he never travelled to the historic Trojan plain himself, he inspired vast numbers of romantically inclined young men to make the journey. One of the best-known poets to be linked with Troy is Lord Byron, but his infamous reputation undoubtedly surpasses any fame his poetry might have brought him. A wild child, if ever there was one, Byron certainly enjoyed the good life, wine, women and, if not song, then at the very least, epic verse. Byron first arrived in Greece in 1809 and immediately identified with the place, saying, "If I am a poet, it is the air of Greece that has made me one." Travelling the region, he revelled in the history and culture, and when he got to the Trojan plain, it was most definitely the army of Achilles he felt affinity with. Like most visitors to Troy today, he crossed the Hellespont, better known as the Dardanelles, but not, of course, by car ferry. In fact, Byron must have been a strong swimmer, because on one occasion he actually swam the Hellespont, some 3 miles across at the narrowest point. Byron did everything within his power to soak up the atmosphere of the place. In truth, he spent more time on the Trojan plain than most, which did make him rather supercilious towards the armchair Homer scholars. It is one thing to read the Iliad with Mount Ida above you, another to trim your taper over it in a snug library. This I know. Even if you never get as far as reading the poems of Byron, on or off the Trojan plain, there's an interesting twist in the tale. Byron was so influenced by the ancient Greeks of the past, he was swept romantically along with events of his own time. In 1823, Lord Byron left his classically beautiful ancestral home, Newstead Abbey, and the scandals that beset him in England, to return to Greece, despite the fact that he was convinced he was sailing towards his own death. The Greeks were embroiled in the War of Independence against the Turks, and Byron was received as a hero when he joined the Greek forces in their fight for freedom. The rebel had found a cause at last. Sadly for Byron, his premonition was well-founded. He died in Messalongi in 1824 of a fever. His timing couldn't have been worse. Not only did he die before seeing the Greeks win their liberation, he also never learned of the success of his literary offerings and the fact that the British nation had accepted him, forgiving his numerous indiscretions for the sake of art. In true Trojan hero style, after such a tragic end, the question of where Lord Byron's mortal remains should be laid to rest caused some dispute. Rather than burying him in the land he so loved, he was returned to England, the prodigal son, where a heroic grave in Westminster Abbey or even St. Paul's in London was envisaged for the poet's final destination. Typical of Byron's poor run of luck, the Church of England was more unforgiving than the nation's reading public. There was no way Lord Byron, womanizer extraordinaire, was ever going to be allowed a state burial in either of the highest churches in the land. Consequently, Byron was buried minus pomp and circumstance at a tiny rural church close to Newstead Abbey, when he could have been entombed as an adopted Greek hero. Knowing Byron's love of the story of Troy, the epic poems of Homer, and the affinity he felt for Achilles, it's probable he'd have much preferred some glorious corner of a foreign field to the ignominy of England. Having just seriously misquoted the famous lines of World War I poet Rupert Brooke, we can neatly move another century on from Byron to investigate a more recent conflict to be fought in the region of Troy. Rupert Brooke's poem, The Soldier, actually ran, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Like so many British soldiers, Rupert Brooke sailed for the Dardanelles in 1915, a strategically important location as the Allied forces planned to seize control of this narrow waterway that linked Europe to Asia. It was an ill-conceived campaign, and the mention of Gallipoli, the peninsula where the battles were fought, is synonymous with tragedy. As well as the British, there are the dead of other nations buried in the foreign field of Gallipoli, as more than 500,000 men perished here, representing Australia, Britain, France, India, and New Zealand. On board the battleships, Gallipoli bound, there were numerous copies of Homer's Iliad in the personal belongings of young soldiers, and Rupert Brooke was no exception. He vowed to recite the lines of Homer as he followed in the wake of Achilles, scribbling words of his own to add to the great bards. "Wake all amazed and hear the guns, and shake for Troy again." Rupert Brooke ironically never reached Gallipoli, his ship being diverted to Egypt before he saw action. By the time he was back in the Aegean, Brooke had fallen ill, suffering recurring dysentery, and when an insect bite led to blood poisoning, he died on the 23rd of April, 1915. His own poignant words proved to be a perfect epitaph. Rupert Brooke was buried on the Greek island of Skyros, in some corner of a foreign field, where indeed a richer dust was in a rich earth concealed. If Homer spoke in the Iliad with the voice of the combatants of both sides of the Trojan War, his inspirational verse echoes through the words of Rupert Brooke, speaking for all brave young soldiers of the past, present and future facing death in combat. As we reach the end of our search for Troy and our quest to find out what really happened here, we have no more proof to support the case for Homer's great legend than when we first began. However, at journey's end you do realise that hard facts and evidence are the least important part of the story. The reason for the enduring popularity of Troy is the humanity of the tale. Achilles, Hector, Helen, Menelaus and Agamemnon are all legendary heroes who, if they ever existed at all, lived and died for love, honour and power, and what has really changed through the centuries. Wars are still fought, power struggles tear nations apart, and the innocent caught in the crossfire simply strive to survive. It's rarely a woman's beautiful face that is the catalyst anymore for such carnage as happened at Troy, but the same greed and desire to possess will usually be found at the root of every conflict. This is why Troy, so poetically immortalised by Homer, will always be an inspiration, particularly in times of trouble. Because despite belonging to the realms of ancient history, Troy truly is, and always will be, a story of our time.